And then what happened, Dr. Adelson?
Then I got kicked out of a hotel casino because I couldn't wait 5 minutes not to in the bathroom.
Ben,
I'm a professor.
You were a guest of the University of Tokyo. Like that's a really this is a really serious problem.
I may have confused two stories.
But I'm just like, you were there to give a lecture at the University of Tokyo, Ben.
What's going on?
I'm Professor Abelson.
Whoa! I'm seeing double. What's happening?
Wait, was this recording?
What's going on?
Haven't started recording.
Butts.
You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, Minisode, number that it is.
We should just start dating them.
Yeah, well,
the whole point of the Minisode is it comes out right when we record it.
But it's coming out Friday, November 8th.
We are reflecting on episode 6.
Yes.
Which dealt with the history of women in professional wrestling. I'd like to come out right away and correct somewhat of a mistake from the episode. I had dated Mildred Burke as the 50s, as having been prominent in the 50s and 60s, but actually her heyday was a bit earlier than that. It was from the mid-30s to the mid-50s. She actually retired in 1956, and her successor as the top women's wrestler in the world was June Byers. And I think, Doc, you know a little bit more about that story than I do.
I mean, a bit. If you had gotten me a few years ago, I would have the history in my head a lot better. Yeah, June Byers, she was the top woman for a long time between Mildred Burke and Moolah. No, there are better resources than me to find the history of women's wrestling in America. It's not just Moolah, and it's not just these few women. So check it out yourself.
We'll do some proper research on that era and try to find whatever video is available for a future episode. Perhaps
some of it is on the Chicago Film Archives YouTube channel that I've mentioned once or twice. One day I'll show Evan some of that and see what he thinks about wrestling from the 50s.
I do want to take responsibility for the fact that Ben pointed out to me this was an issue in the episode quite some time ago. And I could have just edited it out, and I didn't because I was lazy and I just didn't.
You didn't want to.
It was my mistake to begin with, so that's all right. I was trying to go through the whole history of women's wrestling very quickly, and so misspoke.
It seems to be popping off now. It seems like there's high profile. There have been some high profile women's matches. We need to go back and actually and watch more of them.
Yeah. I mean, I say by far the most interesting stuff that's happening in the WWE right now involves the women.
I think the best book title in the WWE is the NXT Women's Championship, and has been for years.
Yes, absolutely. And right now, Shayna Baszler is as good as anybody else in the entire company.
She's killing it. She's really just killing it.
And I think for the upcoming Survivor Series, the women's match. So this year, the Survivor Series theme is Raw versus SmackDown versus NXT. And the match between the Raw Women's Champion, the SmackDown Women's Champion, and the NXT Women's Champion, who are Becky Lynch, Bayley, and Shayna Baszler, respectively, is, for me, the most interesting match on the card.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
What ballpark figure?
Mm-hmm.
What's the breakdown, male wrestlers to female wrestlers, right now? Not historically. I'm going to assume it's crazy.
In total,
in the whole business.
I would say percentage wise, based on your experience based on two things, based on your experiences in indie gyms and on the indie scene, and then also based on your knowledge of current, TV level wrestling.
Well, it's still very male dominated, but most independent wrestling shows will have one or two women's matches on it by now, whereas several years ago, a lot of them just didn't even bother. And the ratio is changing rapidly.
I'd say Chikara probably has a more even split, but they're unusual in that respect, right?
Yeah, and even Chikara only has a few women regularly appearing for them. They've just been doing it longer. On television, the WWE, I guess we could, it's easy to, if we go to the WWE website and just look at the roster, we could answer this question. I'm not going to get
I think it might be up to like 70-30 at this point.
And
Wow.
once again, growing the more time that they give the women, they've gone back and forth on it, but compared to how it was like as recent as like 4 or 5 years ago, the improvement is marked and drastic.
Speaking of which, I read AJ Lee's autobiography for a presentation I gave at the Midwest Popular Culture Association conference. And shout out to the MPCA, ACA. It's the Midwest Popular Culture Association and American Culture Association. Most fun academic conference I've ever been to. Everyone there is awesome. Dr. Carrie Lynn Reinhardt invited me to her panel on mental health and fandom. We are now co-editing with Dr. Allison Levin a edited collection of those papers. We have a call for papers out right now, actually. So I was reading AJ's autobiography about her time in wrestling, her struggles with mental health, and I thought I would share just a couple of very telling passages from the book.
Let's hear it.
So the first one comes from when AJ was in developmental for WWE, which was Florida Championship Wrestling at the time. And she was starting to get a couple of spots on the main roster. This is on page 191 of the book. But on the other calloused hand, progression through the wrestling ranks was painfully slow. For 2 years, I had spent every waking hour training in one form or another. Occasionally, I would see a glimmer of light when I'd get an invite to travel with the main roster. However, at the time, when a female wrestler went on the road for a trial period, it was only in a hosting capacity on untelevised events, while the guys got to have matches on the house shows, smaller arena shows where wrestlers and producers would try out ideas for the TV programming. The women would host a fan trivia question or dance contest. Women had more opportunities in speaking/character valet roles than in the ring during this era. So we hopefuls had to first demonstrate we could be bubbly and charming before we would get our chance. The host was only required to do 2 things: wear a dress and speak to the audience without stammering. 1 out of 2 would have to do. So there's that. Then this is the really damning part. This is now page 203. This is when NXT, before it became a brand unto itself as a wrestling league, it was a kind of reality show that they had on TV where they would take people from developmental and sort of have them compete in inane contests that were unrelated to wrestling.
Run the obstacle course.
Yeah, and so they did a season with women.
Go into the stands and sell popcorn.
So,
Daniel Bryan went into the stands with a big thing of popcorn when he was on NXT and just started throwing boxes to the crowd, shouting that he didn't believe in capitalism, that everything should be free.
So,
Damn, we got to do this Daniel Bryan episode soon.
He's pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on, Ben.
So AJ is starting to go against the grain at this point. She's not trying to dress like hot or whatever. She's wearing her Converse. And, like she had kind of like a skater kind of look. So she says, now on page 204, I wanted to start chipping away at that glass ceiling. I wanted to throw rocks at it little by little until I made a crack. If taking a risk and pissing people off meant having even the smallest shots at changing the landscape for myself and every woman who came after me, then it was a risk worth taking. And it worked. The fan response was overwhelming. Most important, the fans were tired of watching women's wrestling that didn't take itself seriously. They were itching for talented matches with exciting performances. They wanted to rally behind a female performer, not just catcall her. I felt embraced and accepted, like I was the audience's voice in the competition. So she was just trying to wrestle as well as she could, dressed however she felt comfortable dressing, and just tried to be a wrestler more than anything else. But not everyone was as hopeful as I was. Back in talent relations. Look, we know you can wrestle, and not many women can. We appreciate that. We just want you to understand that it's important to be the full package. Right now, you're the best wrestler in the competition. Our female fans want to dress like you. Our male fans want to hang out and play video games with you. But no one wants to have sex with you. Do you see how that's a problem for us? I don't know how they do things in FCW, but here we have a standard our women are proud to stand up to. This is in 2011,
Jesus.
I believe.
And this is the voice of Vince.
This is,
Essentially.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, like, even if he's not, whoever.
I think it was
is-
probably, who's that guy they
Probably
have on Total
Johnny
Divas?
Ace, right?
Well, who's that guy? Mark
I
Carano?
don't watch Total Divas.
I think it might be this. Oh man!
But whoever is saying
whoever, yeah.
whoever is saying this to her is speaking with the full authority of this is
Oh, yeah,
our
that's
house.
the company
This
line.
is what we
Yeah,
do.
Like pointing out that the fans are responding well to you. They all like
Yeah,
you.
the fans
Yeah.
really like you, but they don't like you in the way that we think is the only way that people can like female wrestlers. And so since it doesn't fucking compute, we're actually going to ask you to do the same dumb shit.
You wonder why the women's division just wasn't over at the time, because they weren't listening to what the fans wanted, which was a real women's division. And eventually they did. Now there is a real women's division, but it was ridiculous. We pointed out in the episode that we're reflecting on, that there wasn't the same kind of backlash amongst wrestling fans when women took more of the spotlight than there was in other kinds of media. And it's because the fans wanted it. The fans wanted a better representation on television of female wrestlers. It just wasn't. It was unconscionable that they wouldn't let AJ Lee be AJ Lee because of how good she was. When they finally did, she was dynamite and she got over huge.
The only way that this attitude would be acceptable is if, like in Brock Lesnar's autobiography, there was also a scene where Vince McMahon was just like, Brock, like, no one's trying to get that dick. That still would be bad and objectifying, but at least would be equally spread out, right?
In a Smoky Mountain Wrestling in the mid-'90s, run by Jim Cornette, as the story goes, he got Chris Jericho and Lance Storm, and he thought they'd be great because the girls would come to see them, but he kept getting angry at them because they wouldn't bang the women who were coming to the shows to see them and try and bang them. Because Chris Jericho didn't want to have sex with any random fan that came up with him. And Lance Storm married young and was very faithful to his wife. And it was a small promotion. Cornette's like, well, once word gets out you're not going to have sex with the fans, why would anybody come and see you? So, there is actually some precedent for this happening to the guys at points in wrestling history as well. We give our bodies to the business in a variety of ways.
It's this like old school idea that everything that you do, I don't know if it's Freud's fault or what, that like everything you do has to be motivated by sex.
Well, I think it's a few things. One is that men with power who like to feel like they're in charge of shit, there's always going to be a sexual component to that. And it's also, and I mean, maybe this is overly political, but at this point I feel like we've abandoned all pretense, or at least I have abandoned all pretense, where it's the fact that we figured out at some point in the early 20th century, or Edward Bernays specifically, like, popularized the concept, like, well, just plug the fuck part of the brain into the buy-in shit part of the brain, and we've just never moved on from that as a society because it's unstoppable, because it's an unstoppable force.
So, I mean, I think we've come some distance, some positive ways away from that in the wrestling business, but it still seems like, one step forward, 3 steps back. So they've returned to having like storylines on WWE programming that are about either men fighting over a woman as a trophy, or a conniving woman, like, using sex to her advantage to manipulate men.
I'm gonna have sex with the guy you don't like. Ha ha ha.
Yeah, that's what they're doing with Lana and Bobby Lashley and that whole storyline. I mean, I don't really know the details. I haven't been watching Raw.
I have not been watching Raw. I watch a lot of wrestling, and Raw is like 7th on the priority list now. I'll read what happens on Raw and all that, but I read what happens on Raw and I think, I'm glad I didn't spend 3 hours of my time.
On the most
watching
recent Saudi Arabia show, they had a women's match.
Yeah.
They had
Right,
Natalya
yeah.
and Lacey Evans have the first ever match in Saudi Arabia. I don't know how they got that cleared with
Apparently they've been trying
MBS.
since they started doing these shows to get that. So, I mean, that's,
And
better that they did it than they didn't, but there's still all the problems with the Saudi Arabia
Right.
shows in the first place.
At least it was very well received by the crowd. And, they did, they're such fucking spin artists, but, they made sure to collect the, 20 women in the crowd and put them all in the front row.
Oh, those shows are propaganda shows. They have quotas of how many women they have to have in those shows, and this isn't like a secret. You can check it out. They want a lot of women in the audience for those shows because the propaganda is they want to show the rest of the world how well they're treating their women.
Right. And the women's wrestlers were completely covered up. Not their faces, but
they were wearing their gear, and then over their gear they were wearing oversized T-shirts to hide anything about their form.
It wasn't their normal gear either. It was completely covering black latex. But the other thing I thought was interesting was the only women they flew over for the show, and the two women who ended up being in the match, were the blondest, most Barbie-looking, conventional American beauties that they could come up with. And I thought a while about the psychology of that and why you would present that. And I don't know exactly what it is. I don't know if it's sort of for the Saudis, oh yeah, those American women can, demean themselves by wrestling, but, not anybody more like us, or if it's more yes, this is fucking American women who are so free and unencumbered that they could. I don't really know what
WWE doesn't. Does
is in
WWE
there.
have any Middle Eastern women on the main roster?
No, but they do have dark-haired women and
This is
women
true.
of color.
Yes.
They could have had Sasha. I don't know. Maybe Sasha Banks didn't want to fucking go there.
Right, maybe Sasha didn't want to go.
I would hope not. Or at least, I guess I could imagine that the women who did go were no, you know what, fuck you, I'm gonna go fucking wrestle in Saudi Arabia.
Is Natty Neidhart, who would do whatever the company said to her, and Lacey Evans, who was in the American military, and she doesn't care where they send her.
Yeah.
Lacey Evans, by the way, is going to be, once she gets a little bit better at wrestling, she's going to be a huge star because she is the soldier who's also a pinup.
So she's basically she's John Cena. But although he wasn't actually in the military, right? That was just his deal.
No, that was just the movies he was in.
That was
They were gonna put Randy Orton in the Marine 2, right? Was it? Yeah, he was gonna be in the Marine 2, and then the Marines contacted the WWE and said, Randy Orton got a dishonorable discharge from the actual Marines.
Whoa.
Can you not make him known
what?
as the Marine? He didn't want to actually join, but he did, and then he realized he didn't like it, so he just messed around like you're not supposed to do in the military. He's done interviews about it. He's lucky they didn't throw him in the brig. He really shouldn't have joined the military.
By the way, did you notice that they threw a bottle at Natalia during her entrance?
Jesus.
Yes.
In Saudi Arabia?
In Saudi Arabia, yeah. Also, right now, just talking about Bayley, because, the episode we featured Bayley versus Sasha Banks. When Bayley got to the main roster, and we talked a little bit about this about NXT in general, they just ruined her character. They didn't know how to make this, sort of pure baby face, not angry, not aggressive kind of character work on TV. And so they infantilized her. She was doing roses are red, violets are blue kind of poetry on, and it just sucked. And they did nothing interesting with her for long enough that the crowd became disinterested in her character, which just boggles my mind because I feel like she could be so marketable. She could have been the John Cena of the women's division. And now they've turned her heel, which is sort of the right move. And I think I don't know. We talked about this. We'll talk about this a little bit in a future episode. Yeah. But I don't know. I think they've just done Bayley so wrong at this point. She's doing the best that she can with what they give her, but
it seems like that's a character that you could really easily you didn't need to mess with anything.
Yeah.
She had this character down. It seemed like it was perfect in NXT. And then even if you were going to make that character a heel, you don't really have to change it that much.
Yeah, they gave her a new haircut, and now she's petulant.
I feel like you could just be like I'm bright and I'm bubbly and fuck you. You don't really have to do.
I think they had this idea that she had to be corrupted. Like a character like that could not survive in the Viper's pit that is Raw.
Yeah, and that's very much the personal philosophy that they put forward. So I wouldn't be surprised.
It's unrelated to everything, but I just saw it while I was looking something up on Wikipedia related to the Saudi Arabia match.
boy.
This isn't really that notable, I guess, because none of us are particularly young anymore, but Mohammed bin Salman is younger than all three of us.
Oh, yes, he is.
Super weird.
One of the most powerful men in the world.
Yeah.
So also Jerry Lawler is back on TV as a regular commentator
Yeah, we had written him off.
That's not
on Monday Night Raw.
That's not a plus for society.
And NXT is on broadcast television now on USA.
No.
Cable, yeah.
And
Was it just on the app?
It was-
before?
it was just on the
It was one
network.
of the main
Yeah.
selling points for the WWE Network.
And-
They moved it to Wednesday nights.
The ratings haven't been that great. I mean, they had this whole invasion of SmackDown recently.
Did you see this week's rating?
No, it's this week's rating.
It went up. It was like hold on, let me look at the actual thing. Hold on. Brian Alvarez reports it on Twitter. Real shorthand.
So there was a debacle in Saudi Arabia where like there was some discrepancy in the WWE getting paid by Saudi Arabia for their shows, so they cut the live feed of the last show in Saudi Arabia. So there are conflicting reports about what was actually going on. What ended up happening was the wrestlers were stuck in Saudi Arabia with their plane not taking off for hours and hours and hours, for like a whole day basically. And so they had nobody to be on SmackDown. So they just they flew in the NXT guys to do SmackDown. And it was the best SmackDown in years.
Yeah, it was pretty fantastic. They're probably going to have one or two of them on because the theme of Survivor Series is all three brands are going to face each other. But yeah.
I mean, it was all the NXT guys, most of the women who didn't go to Saudi Arabia,
Right.
and Daniel Bryan,
Oh, that's
who refuses to
fantastic.
go.
Yeah. So NXT did 813,000 viewers this week, which is way up from the 500 something thousand of the previous week. The previous week had competition. It's on the same time slot as the AEW show. So now it's kind of the new Wednesday Night Wars, except media has changed, so it's not as important. But last week it was also up against Game 7 of the World Series. NXT did 813,000 viewers. AEW did 822,000 viewers. Both of those numbers are up
close.
from the previous week, but it's very tight. Very tight. The NXT being on Raw and SmackDown really helped put eyes on the brand this week.
800,000 in 2019
Yeah.
is about 17 million in the mid 90s.
The USA
Well,
Network is
yeah.
happy with it, and TNT is very happy with what AEW is doing.
What did Raw do at its peak? Like 9-10 million?
Oh, at its peak, not quite. It did. The highest rated episodes of Raw got about 8 or 9 million people, and at its peak consistently it could get like 6.5 million. Now it does between 2 and 3. It's been slowly declining almost consistently since 2002.
As we predicted, AEW champion Chris Jericho, as we predicted on episode 6, and by far the most interesting part of that show.
He's fantastic. Just how can he continuously improve himself as a performer all these years? Yeah, the video package he did on AEW this week was just masterful, with him and his crew of guys, and Sammy Guevara reminding everyone he's the youngest ever AEW champion. It's like he's 48. He's in the prime of his life. He's the youngest ever AEW champion. It's like just slow clap, Mr. Jericho. Slow clap.
I mentioned that Joshi, Japanese women's wrestling, was really great in the 90s. I'd like to point out that it actually started being really great in the 80s. And the Jumping Bomb Angels actually came to the U.S. and wrestled in the WWF for a little while and were amazing. They pulled off stuff that we didn't see from any other wrestlers in the WWF for at least another decade.
Yeah. Just crazy stuff. And women's wrestling in Japan is on the rise now. The company that owns New Japan recently bought Stardom. That doesn't mean that Stardom is a Japanese women's wrestling league. That doesn't mean that Stardom is being absorbed by New Japan, which is probably what would have happened in America. But there's rumors that they might do a Stardom match at one of the Tokyo Dome shows. We'll see. That would be cool.
It is notable that there is no women's wrestling on New Japan.
So in Japan, the idea is more, from the women's wrestling perspective is, why would we want to be ninth down on the card on a men's wrestling show? We just have our own shows. And there are several women's wrestling leagues in Japan. None of them nearly as big as New Japan, but that's more the mentality. Well, New Japan doesn't have a women's division. There are just women's leagues.
In the 90s, though, the Joshi leagues were as big as the men's leagues.
NJW or AJW, like All Japan Women for a while, was the biggest league in Japan and put on the best stuff. And every time I'm not an expert on it, but anytime I look any of it up on YouTube, it's fantastic. And that ran through the early 90s.
We'll cover some of it eventually, for sure.
Minami Toyota and Bull Nakano. And
I also wanted to split some hairs with another thing that I said. I called NXT the cutting edge of wrestling right now. I don't know if it's the cutting edge. I'd say something like Beyond is the cutting edge, where they're doing the most like avant-garde, weird stuff. NXT is the state of the art. NXT is the best example of contemporary wrestling, I think.
That's a good distinction to make.
It's like the distinction between like experimental music versus prog versus progressive music. Experimental, you're kind of throwing shit at the wall. And it's really interesting in that way, but prog is when you figured something out, you have a vision, and you're able to realize that vision.
Are you starting to see NXT and its style and influence filtering up into the other brands?
It's hard to say because most of the people on the other brands went through NXT in the first place.
And they just always water them down, and they're never as interesting, with a few exceptions.
And Triple H, who essentially runs NXT, is fine with that. The way he always puts it is NXT is trying to capture the idea of seeing, a punk band in a punk band club. And then when you go to Monday Night Raw, it's like you're trying to see AC/DC at the Garden. Well, I've seen AC/DC at the Garden, and AC/DC at the Garden is a lot better than Monday Night Raw.
But now that NXT is on actual TV, they don't have to rush people off of it to the main roster as quickly. And they're going to kind of let it be its own brand with its own roster for a while longer now.
We'll see how it goes.
One other thing I wanted to mention, I talked about the Chris Benoit, Kevin Sullivan feud in WCW, and I said something about Benoit stealing Kevin Sullivan's wife, which isn't the best way to describe that. Nancy Sullivan was leaving Kevin Sullivan for Benoit at the time. That is Nancy Benoit, who Chris Benoit murdered when he also killed himself.
So you don't respect murder victims, is what you're saying.
Daniel.
Is what happened.
Is that what happened?
I think you're saying you didn't, but you'd like to.
I appreciate that correction. Actually.
Yeah, it's an archaic way of talking that I
yeah.
think people still use a lot, and
also I'm sure in the wrestling context too, that is usually how they frame those kinds of storylines.
Definitely.
So when you're talking about
I was using air quotes. You just couldn't see them.
Well, yeah, we'll start doing the video episodes. I was on a serious note. Please, we're gonna fuck this up. We're the three of us. We're trying. We're all guys who made a lot of dumb jokes when we were younger and are trying to be better about how we talk about all this stuff. So if you care to, please yell at us on Twitter. If
Twitter is for.
If we get things wrong, and because we will listen and we want to be better. And I respect you coming out and being like, hey, I said this in a way that was poorly.
Listening back on it,
yeah.
It didn't sound good to me.
Yeah,
that's really all it is.
There you go. And you're like, let me put it a different way.
Yeah. Everything I've ever said is fine, and I apologize for nothing. That's not true. I apologize for all of it.
It's not, it's not the fucking social thought police coming down on me. We had Danielle here as a guest. She didn't complain about it. It's nothing about that. It's purely that I didn't like how it sounded to my own ears.
Well, and it's important to remember, it's not guilt. It's genuinely wanting to do better. And that's what I think people who criticize, people who criticize guys who try to be better and try to break out of that, old way of thinking and the old way of making jokes and shit like that, and say that it's, out of guilt or that we're virtue signaling or something like that. No, it's a genuine desire to be better. So fuck you. That's the way that I'm better. I'm better than you, motherfucker.
Oh.
It's getting aggressive. It's very late. We're all super
It's,
tired, and we're gonna be up very early tomorrow. At least Doc is, because Doc is going to be guesting on somebody else's podcast.
The Wrestling Time Machine.
I'm going to be on the Wrestling Time Machine podcast. We're going to be recording very early in the morning tomorrow morning. I'm going to make my way to where I live, get a few hours of sleep, get a Monster Energy drink in me. Evan, ever since you described Roman Reigns as Monster Energy Spider-Man, that's all I can picture him as, and it's an improvement. So thank you for that, and I'll be up with a smile on my face, not that anybody will be able to see it. And we're going to talk WCW World War III, and it's going to be great.
Full disclosure, we usually record these episodes Thursday night. We record a regular episode, a premium episode, and then the minisode. Or in other, sometimes we record the premium episode first. After I teach my 3-hour class and Doc and Evan work their day jobs.
I mean, that's if you want to get a piece of media like this off the ground, you have to take it seriously, and that means putting time and energy and effort into it, and that's what we're trying to do with this.
If you would like us to be more focused, present, and less tired during the recordings of these podcasts, please support us on Patreon so we can quit our day jobs.
You will also get an extra bonus episode every week if you join Patreon at the $5 tier. So please consider doing it. If you like the show, we're building an archive right here. Get in on the ground floor.
You get an actual material reward in addition to the general improvement of the podcast.
Yeah, I'm gonna be just as exhausted no matter how much money you give me, because I'm not quitting my job. But I still appreciate it. It'll help me in other areas of my life to have more money for sure.
You have a career. Doc and I have jobs.
That's different. I have a career in the wrestling business, and we all know how much that pays.
Give us support us on Patreon so I can go back to school. This has been Contesting Wrestling.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night.